All right. Oh, good. I can hear me, so I guess everyone else can too. I'd like to welcome everybody to this breakout session that's called the Commercial Space and National Security Defining Successful Partnerships. Now, that's the official name of this. We'll see where this group leads us as we go down the path. I'll tell you, I'm Chuck Beams, a long-time guy in this business. I left. I was Air Force guy and a bunch of other things. I was in OSD for a number of years in Obama's first term, and then I kind of left the business and went into investment banking, private equity, that kind of thing, and I've been kind of more involved in that world than any other ever since, and having a heck of a good time. But I've always stayed close to the folks that and the community that brought me up, frankly. And so it is, I was very thrilled, very excited to be welcomed to be the panel chair for this group. What I'm going to do, before I get started into things, I just have a couple of administrative things to talk through. Each of you saw on your chairs a 3x5 index card, which is for writing down your questions. And we do that for a couple of reasons, but the most significant one, in my opinion, is that the best questions come from the quietest people. And so it serves the role of, one, preventing somebody who has a lot to say about nothing from taking over the conference, and it also allows us to access the smart, introverted, shy type, because they're the ones that often are the deepest thinkers. So don't be shy on your index card. Ask the questions. Ray will collect them up. So when you have something written down, I suggest if you have a burning question, write down pretty soon. Raise your hand. Ray will collect them up, and then they will become part of the panel discussion that we'll have. And we've set aside like half the session. This panel, and I think the panel members would agree, this is about you guys. This is about learning from their perspectives, either their history or the current positions, and having a real dialogue among some of the biggest brains in the business. So the other thing is just a reminder, we all come from the intelligence community. We all spent most of our lives, unless we were in the field, in SCIFs, so we're used to talking very freely, but this is an unclassified environment, so no classified questions, no discussions like that. And also remember that we do have media in the audience. This is open to the media, so we expect and hope that we get some good stories out of it. So that's really it. Masks are required, except for those of us up here on stage. That's just so that you guys can hear us. Masks, it's both a local ordinance and it's also the policy of the Gaylord to implement those. So without further ado, what I'm going to do is I'm going to kind of give a brief intro for each of our panel members, and then after as I introduce each one, I'm going to ask them to talk just briefly about what's important to them, their perspective, whatever they want to say. We'll go down the line doing that, and then I have 1,000 questions for these guys, but I'm going to hold off. I'm going to probably do a couple to get things going, but we're really hoping that we get questions from the audience. So again, don't be shy about that. So my first introduction is Mr. Dave Gauthier. Now, I don't know if they provide bios to the folks and anything, but if you read his official bio, it reads like something out of a Jack Ryan movie. I mean, I'm not kidding you. It's really, he has all these. Well, his current job, he is the director of Commercial and Business Operations Group, which means he's the guy at NGA responsible for doing all the things we're going to talk about basically here. So I said to him before the session got started, he gets the glory and the blame for everything going well and going wrong as we integrate commercial capabilities into our national security infrastructure. But if you look at his, he has a great career. Started off as went to RPI, double majored in double E and aero, I think. You know, so he's a very technical guy, went ROTC, Air Force intelligence officer, but he wasn't just like your, you know, we used to say Joe Bag of Donuts intel officer. He actually had this sort of an interesting career where he was doing actual, what's called intelligence operations, which means he was, you know, he was involved in like human intelligence, that kind of stuff. So pretty exciting, very Jack Ryan. And then he has these other titles that obscure, you know, things that he'll probably never be able to talk about, like Director of Office of Special Programs, and I don't know, all these sort of euphemisms. He also conducted all-source counterterrorism analysis at UCOM. That's hard, that's tough. So he appreciates, I guess the point is he really appreciates the pointy end of the spear of much of what space brings to the fight, especially when it relates to intelligence. And so I'm very excited to have Dave on the panel. And Dave, if you want to take a minute or two, a couple of minutes, and talk a little bit about your perspective on the topic.
Sure. I don't know if these are on.
Yep, we can hear
you. Yeah, we started the Office of Commercial and Business Operations at NGA about 3 years ago, really to knock down some barriers to increase the commercial adoption and use of geospatial intelligence across the government and our allies. And so some of those barriers were just knowledge of what the commercial market has to offer. It's moving so quickly, and the innovations and technologies are moving so fast. Many inside government were just lacked awareness that these opportunities were there in the private sector. Second barrier was access to those things. And so we stood up an acquisition services office. We're trying to get access to new and different types of contracts and acquisitions to do this rapid innovation and adoption. And then along the way, we kind of discovered there are some policy barriers lingering out there as well. And so we got involved in regulatory policy and then stood up the IC Commercial Space Council to start knocking down some of those barriers as well. So all good things. I'm excited about the topic.
Excellent, great. Next up, thanks, Dave, is Mr. Steve Kitay. Steve is somebody I've known for a while now. I first met, I'd heard about him before he came to the Hill, but he was he was a staffer on the HASC, and you know, friendly guy. Very obviously, it takes you about 2 or 3 minutes before you realize he's deeply, he thinks hard about these things. Kind of unassuming, but in many ways. But I can tell you, I quickly learned when I was in OSD that he's a force to reckon with. He really knew in detail. He had the technical chops to understand the technical stuff, and the political and policy savviness to negotiate with his counterparts on the other side of the aisle and on the other side of the Hill to get real policy enacted. And then he, you know, no surprise to any of us, he moved onward and upward and was the DASD, the Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Space Policy, and crushed it. It turned out there's no better time to have that position with standing up the Space Force and just a whole national attention on space generally, in the commercial world as well, with everything that Elon Musk's doing and figuring out how to assimilate that and how to structure a space policy that's usable and useful for everybody and is responsive to the gathering threats out there. So, you know, Steve's he's another you know, big brain engineer guy, and he's currently the director. This is interesting. He, like I did, he kind of went and did something completely different. He's the director of Azure Space at Microsoft. So he now is a director, and his responsibility is leading Microsoft's efforts to connect Azure, which is their cloud infrastructure, with the space sector generally, both commercially and with the government. I know I'm also the executive chairman of a company called York Space Systems, and I was telling him just last week, I said, I don't know if you know this, we're just a small company in Denver, but we run everything on Azure. So thank you for that. I know it makes our company run that much more efficiently and all that kind of thing. So Steve, welcome. It's a pleasure to see you again in person, and if you want to have any opening thoughts or comments, it'd be great.
Yeah, Chuck, thank you for that very, very kind introduction. Although I noticed that you didn't call me Jack Ryan like Dave, but that's probably quite accurate that you didn't. But it's really great to be here with you and my fellow panelists here, actually great friends that I'm alongside up here today, and see a number of friendly faces out in the crowd. As Chuck mentioned, I'm Senior Director for Azure Space at Microsoft, and some of you may be saying, Microsoft and space? And that is fairly new. We started a new vertical in the company about 2 years ago. We publicly launched it last year, and as Chuck was saying, it's all about bringing the cloud and space together. And we're developing new products and services to do that alongside an ecosystem of partners. So I'm looking forward to the discussion today, and we'll move on. So thank you.
Thanks,
Great to be
Steve.
here.
You know, now, the special treat for me, being here as the proverbial game show host for today's panel, is to welcome Audrey Schaefer. You know, anybody who is somebody in the space business or has been around a while knows that the most powerful position, frankly, that a mere mortal can hold in the space business, whether it's in industry or in government, is the senior space policy advisor in the White House. It goes by different terms, but you are the person. We used to say demand, but we don't say it anymore. You are the person who directly advises the President of the United States on space policy. No more important job, and incredibly influential. And well, that's who we have here on our panel today. And her name is Audrey Schaefer. And she comes to the job not out of some think tank, but she earned her stripes coming up through the ranks in doing policy jobs, right? She's, you know, began her career, another big brain. I'm humbled by the CVs of the other folks here on stage. You know, she went to the Untouchable School, MIT, with a BS in Aero. And then she went the policy route after that educationally, George Washington University. Then was a presidential management fellow with the Department of the Air Force. And so she's worked her way up over a career. She was, when Steve decided to go do more fun things, she stepped in to be the acting DASD for space policy. And, the DASD, the bosses, they get all the credit and everything like that, but it's often like the person underneath that does the heavy lifting. And in this case, Audrey was she really drafted the legislative proposal that has become, that put in place the U.S. Space Force. Right, that's an important, very difficult space policy thing to do. Having been involved in that sausage making a little bit myself, I can tell you that hats off to you, Audrey, on that. Again, today she's the president's, not the vice president, we're talking the big guy, and for space policy, and that's not just on military or intelligence stuff, that's on everything, civil, commercial space. So we are very, very lucky to have her. And Audrey, if you have a few introductory comments and thoughts, we'd love to hear them.
Yeah, thanks, Chuck. That was really nice. Yes, I'm the woman in the job. And of course, a lot of the credit for, most of the credit for Space Force actually belongs to the man sitting on my right. But in any case, thanks for inviting me to speak today. Thanks for that really nice introduction. Yes, so I advise the President and the National Security Advisor primarily on national security, space policy matters, but also touching a little bit here and there on civil and certainly commercial space policy. Just really quickly, sort of by way of framing, I wanted to actually draw everyone's attention to the President's Interim National Security Strategic Guidance, which was released in March of this year. It provides kind of an overarching framework for this administration's national security policy and strategy. And if you haven't read it, I would really commend it to you. It's pretty short, it's only about 13 pages. And what it does is describes a really challenging global landscape where China is the only competitor to the United States capable of combining all of its tools of national power to mount a sustained challenge, not really just to the United States, but to the open international system that has served the US and its allies so well since World War II. The reason I bring that up is because I'm looking at space through that lens of strategic competition and thinking about how our space activities, whether they be national security activities, space exploration activities, or commercial activities, actually are both an arena of strategic competition in and of themselves, as well as a tool that we can use to further our strategic competition, sort of at that national level. And so I won't, we can talk more in the Q&A about how that really plays out into a whole different, a whole number of areas in the space field. But suffice to say, I think, when we look at the commercial sector today, we see a really burgeoning market, not just here in the US, but internationally for space-based services. And we really have to think about how we enable US companies to compete internationally to maintain their market share and to grow it. And I think that really starts by building a level playing field for US industry. And so with that, I'll stop and then we can carry the discussion forward during the Q&A.
Excellent. Thank you, Audrey. And thank you for making the time. Of all of us here, you have to have the most jam-packed, except for maybe the colonel over there, but the most jam-packed calendar of anybody. I know many friends over the years have worked in the White House, and there's never a spare minute for anything. So thank you very much for making the time. And last but certainly not least, Lieutenant Colonel Tim Tremelo is active duty. He's now a Space Force Lieutenant Colonel. He took the plunge. I noticed he's got the little Delta things on his lapel, looking pretty sharp. That was not an option when I was in the Air Force, so I think that's pretty cool. He has a long career. Currently, he's the director of what's called Casino, which is actually an acronym, but it's the Air Force's component of DARPA's Blackjack program, which is all about looking at, exploiting, exploring, testing out, prototyping, all things proliferated LEO, or just LEO in general, frankly. And so hopefully he's going to share with us some of his insights that he's gotten from that. But, we were chatting a little bit before we began today, and there's one way to make somebody feel old is when you see a lieutenant colonel, and then he tells you that he graduated from the Air Force Academy in 2005. And I'm thinking, ooh. So we are fellow Zoomies. I'm a few decades before you, but it's good to see they're still cranking out the good ones. He's a space guy, did space acquisition work. Interestingly enough, like myself, when I was active duty, he worked on Capitol Hill for a number of years, kind of started off in the mailroom kind of a thing, handling correspondence and all that kind of stuff, and worked his way up to being a key liaison and brokering some very important deals and important relationships that were in transition, I'll say, to say politely, kind of going on. If folks remember, we weren't sure what we were going to do. We, meaning the Air Force, what it was going to do, what it wanted to do as it related to this thing called the Space Force, and it fell upon a liaison named Tim to be the guy to sort of work with folks on the Hill, like Steve Kitay was in an earlier generation. So it's my honor to welcome. Thank you for your service, Tim, and if you have a few opening comments or thoughts, we're eager to hear them. He flew in from LA.
Yeah, no, thank you. A really kind introduction. I was joking with the other panelists and Mr. Beams earlier that I should probably be off to the kids' table somewhere because I just hold all these people in such high regard, and your reputations precede you. So really humbled to be here, really grateful for the opportunity. So I work out at the Space Systems Command out in Los Angeles, right? We stood up a new field command under the Space Force about a month ago now. And I'll talk more about that as we go through the panel. But I work on a program called Casino, Commercially Augmented Space Internetworked Operations. And so our role at SSC, we fall under the Development Corps and the Innovation and Prototyping Directorate. Our role is as the focal point for SSC on all things proliferated LEO. Our bread and butter, as our moderator mentioned, is Blackjack, so our partnership with DARPA on that very important joint program to demonstrate the military utility of PLEO. We also look at some of the lower hanging fruit, though, on particularly commercial capabilities that we can fold into that future hybrid architecture. How do we fold in proliferated LEO into the architecture, and how do we leverage just the explosion of innovation that's happening on the commercial side? And so I do all that from a kind of proliferated LEO perspective, but really excited to be here and looking forward to all the questions.
Excellent. Thank you, Tim. I'm gonna take a seat now and sort of join the fray a little bit. I'm assuming folks can still hear me. You know, now we're gonna go into, and so get your questions in. Don't be shy. There's no, as I had a boss once say to me, there's no dumb questions, just dumb people. So submit them. You don't have to put your name on them. I'll figure out if I can weave them into the conversation. To get things rolling, though, I thought it would be useful to kind of, you know, jump in with both feet, right? And there's one particular individual on the panel here that this is near and dear to his heart, but I am curious what the different perspectives of our members think. NGA did their own analysis. They do analysis, obviously, threats and all that kind of stuff, but they also do analysis from an industry perspective, and they surveyed the commercial marketplace, and they officially went on record, actually, talking about the fact that many countries, including China and countries in Europe, are almost they're right in our game, and in some areas they beat the United States in terms of commercial space capabilities. I know folks have said that the reason why we've kind of slipped is because we had policies in place in the early 2000s. We don't know who was in charge of policy back then, of course. So, but they really did not encourage the commercial space industry base. So I'm curious, since we have a lot of policy type people up here on stage, like, do you have suggestions or thoughts? We can begin with Dave, and then what can be done? What policy changes do you see as necessary? Can you hear me? Or did it die? Can you hear me? Okay, there it is. What policy changes do you see as necessary? In it, choose whatever lane you like: requirements, acquisition, legislative stuff, whatever. That could be helpful to really, so we don't lose this industry. If we lose this, it'll be gone forever, much like the drone industry. Dave?
All right, thanks, Chuck. And we've talked about this, so it is a topic near and dear to me. And the policies of the early 2000s were perfectly fine for the era in which they were conceived and in which they operated. But as we all know, the strategic environment has shifted significantly since that time frame. And so what we've recognized are some of those policies are now holding us back as a nation in terms of strategic competition. And the first one, I want to talk about two things in particular. One is the regulatory policy for commercial remote sensing and the way that the U.S. licenses operators in that space. And Steve and I worked on this quite a bit when he was in OSD policy. And those regulatory policies were designed to protect our national security in an era where we had a significant technological advantage over anyone else operating, any adversary. And so the idea there was to restrict commercial sales for things that might be harmful to national security, should they be out in the environment. But as the world policy and technologies kind of grew up and achieved parity, that policy was holding us back. And in 2020, July of 2020, we worked very hard to achieve this with Commerce, but the new federal rule was published and the policies were changed, and it was a paradigm shift from national security constraints to selling data that is on par with foreign capabilities and systems. And I'll say the IC Commercial Space Council, which I now chair, is focused on taking it to the next level, saying we need to be able to put better than foreign commercial capabilities out into the market. And so we're working on that policy, and it's come a long way. The second one is, in the IC in particular, we tended to look at commercial capabilities and hold back investing in those capabilities until those companies were quote-unquote commercially viable on their own. And then it was safe for us to invest and partner. And that was fine because it through natural selection in the competitive market forces, got the best companies to the best capabilities, and then we partnered up. That's not how the rest of the world is operating anymore. So I think it's time for us to rethink as a nation, should we be investing more early and more often in what might be game-changing technologies when it's nascent in the commercial marketplace, as opposed to waiting until it's fully formed. And so those are some of my thoughts.
Excellent. You know, I'm curious, I don't mean to jump right over Steve on this one, but Audrey, I'm curious, I think Dave covered the NGA, commercial remote sensing. I'm curious if you have thoughts. One thing that's becoming very important and very significant for everybody in industry, from whether they want to provide those services or they just think they're important to be done, is space traffic management, all that kind of stuff. Do you have a perspective on learning from the lessons of how we kind of fumbled a little bit in the early 2000s, through no fault of their own? They did the best they could at the time. They couldn't have foreseen this big wave. Do you have a perspective on SSA and, you know, now we call it space domain awareness, in what we can do on that front?
Yeah, sure. Thanks for the question. And actually, I kind of want to tie in even to what Dave said in the last one, where, you know, a lot of those policy changes that you mentioned, or rather the policies that were in place 20 years ago and that really drove some of the changes that occurred last year, was really focused on, you know, remote sensing. But we can't sort of ignore the rest of the commercial landscape in terms of other types of capabilities and services that are increasingly being marketed both to government as well as commercially. And so we have to make sure that we continue to sort of anticipate where there are going to be new markets and where U.S. companies are going to be taking the lead, so that we can actually allow them to be competitive in the, you know, sort of without going through that 20-year period of realizing, you know, that the world has changed. And I think space traffic management is actually a really amazing example of that, where you have got these incredible capabilities coming out of the private sector to fuse, you know, data from both government as well as private sector sources, along with these incredible analytical tools to provide the kinds of space traffic management services that frankly are urgently needed. And so I think when we look at the issue of space traffic management, it's really a perfect one for the title of our panel of, you know, defining successful partnerships, because I think you're actually going to need all of the various players, whether that's the DoD and the data that it has, the private sector and the data and tools that it has, as well as, you know, internationally, to really bring together a space traffic management system that can serve not just sort of where we are today, but frankly for the next sort of 50 or 100 years. And when you look at the changes in the number of space objects that are anticipated to be on orbit in the next, you know, 10 years, it is an exponential shift. And the system that we have today is just really not capable. It will not be capable of handling the traffic that we see in 10 or 15 years. But personally, I see an incredible opportunity to bring together all these different actors and entities who are kind of playing in this space, and to have the United States take a leadership role along with U.S. industry internationally to kind of create that system for the future.
Excellent. Thank you. Steve, do you have a perspective?
Yeah, I'll build upon the comments that have been said, and I think it is extremely important to let the industry run and support the industry, and policies have changed over the past year, which is really exciting. Now the next part is implementation of those policies and really moving out with rigor in that. Now, you may be asking why is this so important? Why are the changes important? And Audrey had made the statement that the world has changed, which I completely agree with. And if you look at the space industry, the private investment last year was $9 billion. That was a record year, and it's been going up each year. And that was despite in an environment with COVID. And to me, what that tells me is that the government doesn't have to do it all alone, that the government can leverage these capabilities that are coming out from the commercial sector, and that's really a big mindset shift.
Excellent. There's actually a question for you. It's already come in, Steve, so I'm just going to piggyback on here. It says, they asked, what is the status of the Azure Space program? How is it contracted? And then finally, are there secure capabilities associated with it? So.
Yeah, thank you. So let's start with Azure. So that is our cloud computing platform. So there are secure capabilities out there. We actually have a classified cloud that was just accredited last year last week, within the last couple weeks, to support the U.S. government, the DoD, and the intelligence community. This is a huge change. So in addition to the TS cloud, we have a secret cloud, we have what we call an ITAR cloud, which is essentially, think of it as a cloud that's unclassified but supports an environment that has international export restrictions associated with it, and then there's the commercial cloud. So what this provides is an environment to bring the massive amounts of data together to process and analyze. So these are new capabilities that are coming forward that we're now integrating with the space sector. So I'd mentioned we stood up Azure Space. This is building upon the Azure platform. Now, we're not actually building and launching satellites at Microsoft. That was a decision to be made. It's not necessarily that the company doesn't have the resources there, but the thinking and strategic thinking is there is so much innovation that's happening in the community that we would rather partner with those in the industry rather than try and replicate it. So an example of the partnerships we're building out is with SpaceX and their Starlink constellation, which is getting up to thousands of satellites, getting to what Tim was talking about earlier with proliferated LEO, low Earth orbit constellations, to provide connectivity at low latency across the globe. We're also partnering with SES in medium Earth orbit. So what we're trying to do is bring forward solutions that are resilient and provide options to our customers.
Excellent. Thanks. Thanks for that, Steve. And Tim, I'm curious your perspective on this topic, and then I'd like you to lead my second question. But first, do you have thoughts as it relates to this particular thing?
Yeah, I'll talk about it more from the tactical program office kind of level, not so much the higher level policy, right? But kind of how I see it, the boots on the ground managing programs. So really, our requirements and our programs have to give us enough flexibility to be able to partner with some of these commercial companies, especially some of the new space companies, non-traditionals, startups, right? As well as the bigs. I think that SSC has a laser focus on the threat today. And what we do in casino kind of takes the traditional acquisition model and kind of how you look at building systems and flips it on its head. And what I mean by that is traditionally we'd have very specific requirements with very specific objectives and thresholds that are validated at a very high level. And we build specific solutions to meet those requirements. Often those are custom solutions, and they're not cheap, and sometimes they take a while to build, but they're exquisite. And they satisfy well over 90%, 95, 98% of the requirements. And then often we take those custom solutions, and after that we look at some of the commercial capabilities that we can leverage, and we augment the architecture with those commercial services. What we're trying to do on casino is actually flip that model on its head and start with more of that low-hanging fruit, more of the commercial services up front. And there are three ways that I think we're trying to do that. The first one is adoption of services. So that's like subscriptions, that's like your satellite radio in your car. What are the commercial services that we could take advantage of in a subscription sort of style that we can leverage today for the warfighter? The second example is what I call buy. So can we buy into existing production runs for some of these PLEO constellations or other? Can we buy commercial buses and host our payloads? Can we buy commercial sensors and host them on our government buses? So buy is the second one. The third one is modify. So in those first two examples, we're actually not modifying or tweaking that commercial capability whatsoever. In fact, we're doing our best not to touch it whatsoever. We just want to leverage it to the best of our ability. But in the modify sort of paradigm, we're just making small tweaks. You might be building an app or a widget, an interface plate to take advantage of that capability, but we're just doing a little bit of modification. All three of those examples, we're leveraging the commercial capability and trying our best not to tinker with it. And then we might realize that we can get 50, 60, 80% of the requirement actually met with those commercial capabilities. And then we have the choice, right, the decision space, to be able to make a decision whether we're going to build that custom solution. And our leadership kind of refers to this whole thing I just described as buy before you build.
Excellent. My next question kind of flows from that. You mentioned that you're flipping things. Your office specifically, unique among all the offices out there at Space Systems Command, is trying to flip the script, as we used to say, on this kind of stuff. I know Dave knows this, and I think Steve knows this. I'm more than anything else. I wear many hats, but I'm an investor in the new space sort of arena, right? And there's such those two worlds collide. They're just completely different, right? All these companies are about leveraging Moore's Law, huge private capital that Steve talked about, and then the innovation in the tech sector, the data sort of information revolution that we're all living in, and figure out how to allow the government, how to encourage the government to leverage this instead of continuing down this path, which it's been doing for 50 years, of basically saying we have this requirement, and now we got to go hire the traditional guys to go do that. So do you have, and a lot of us, frankly, I'll tell you, we use these terms like partnering, and we want to partner with these guys, and I don't even know what that means anymore, frankly, but I can tell you as an investor what's important when you buy things, right? When the government actually buys a service or buys a product, because when I'm looking at valuation and how much to buy a company for, or to take something public or whatever, revenue counts, and revenue against the actual viable product that the company has is huge, right? That's where you get the multiples of 20x, 25x. And so I'm curious, and Tim, I'd like you to lead this one, and then I'd be curious, actually, Audrey's perspective on this as being at the, not to put LA at the bottom of the food chain, but you actually execute policy, and she makes it at the very top of the food chain. So Tim, I'm curious your perspective first, and then Audrey's.
Yeah, so I think in order to take advantage of commercial capability more smartly, we've got to prototype it, right? We've actually got to move out, put things on contract. And again, I'll speak from a casino kind of centric perspective. What we try to do on our projects, they might not be massive amounts of dollars. It might be small dollar projects, but we're trying to move out swiftly with tools like SSC's Space Enterprise Consortium, the OTA contract. And we're trying to actually, our periods of performance on those contracts are often 6, 9, 12 months. They're not 5 years, right? So we're trying to move out quickly in short periods of time and have more of that DevSecOps approach, bringing in the user up front to say, hey, there's this commercial service or capability out here. Do you think that would be useful? And how would you use it, in a prototype perspective? So if we can prototype quickly, if we're going to fail, right, fail fast but learn fast and move on, we can start to kind of get into that spiral development, kind of tweaking as we go, and really start to deliver meaningful capability much sooner than later.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, Chuck, I don't know that I have a lot to add to this one. In this case, I actually think it is really right to start with Tim, because if you look at national level policies on commercial space, they've actually been consistent in a good way, for this 20 plus period years that we've been talking about, in that they've directed the U.S. government to buy commercial goods and services first, before considering, bespoke government solutions, for that entire period. And so the policy has been very clear and very consistent, and actually the challenge has been in the implementation.
Yeah.
And so for me, it's really great to hear remarks like Tim's and like Dave's. We're talking about how the actual procurement arms of the government are actually changing their practices to really sort of put that policy into effect in a way that we've never really seen it before. And so I personally am just really heartened to hear how these policies are sort of finally coming to fruition.
I think that's a great point. A lot of these policies were put in place by your predecessors years ago that I worked with, and so maybe part of the sticking point is in the actual execution. Dave, you got to.
Yeah, so I wanted to briefly mention our procurement model as well, and one of the things we recognized was we could buy commercial capabilities, but we had a bottleneck in the cultural adoption of those capabilities amongst our workforce and our analysts. And so I'm pretty proud to say that Vice Admiral Sharp is about to sign out an NSG Enterprise Commercial Geo and Strategy. And for the first time, this strategy makes the paradigm shift that tells our entire community of GeoInt professionals, thou shalt go out and use commercial sources as primary sources of intelligence for your production.
Yeah, that's a big deal.
And because just like the Colonel said, it has always been the reflex to use commercial as augmentation, not as the beginning of the process or the foundation of what you're trying to do as an intelligence professional. So that is us flipping the script and saying that in strategy to the workforce and the enterprise, and then following through with the procurement activities that we see. We've been very focused on commercial analytic services because of their ease of integration and ease of adoption into the workflow. And if someone can provide information as a service, it just becomes one more supply line of source information that we can use to make insights about the world. And so I'm very proud to say we've put in place 3 new services contracts in the last 6 months to go after procuring commercial SAR services from the community, to go after emitters, RF emitters, and provide that as a service. We're looking for certain RF emanations in certain places, and when they're seen, give us the tip-off. We don't need raw data, we just need the alerts. And then the third one is now economic indications and monitoring. We want monitoring services of economic activity around the world. So again, I'm really pleased to hear how well in agreement we are across the panel here about using commercial first and using services.
Excellent. And Steve, you have a perspective on that one? You were always one of these guys way up at the top in government that didn't get your hands dirty with all the, action.
Well, I'm certainly now on the other side, getting my hands dirty as we're developing out the technologies to bring forward here. An example of that is what we did for the casino program. We worked with Ball Aerospace to take OPIR data, not only process it in the cloud, but also process it in the field on an edge device. So that's an example where I think that innovation is really happening. Now the challenge is going from those prototypes to then scaling and actually integrating. And I think part of it is, to Dave's point, how do you get the rest of the workforce on board? So maybe a demonstration was done within the acquisition community, but where does it go from there? I think part of the keys to that is having the acquisition and the operational community tightly joined at the hip on these programs so that adoption happens from the beginning, and there's a tight feedback loop, and iteration is happening early, so they are coming on board, and the people who actually are going to depend on these services develop the comfort and are able to give the feedback as the capabilities are developing. So I think as these programs mature, these organizations mature, the Space Force and the SSC, having operations and acquisition tightly integrated is a key to it.
Excellent. I have a question related to the cyber, and for decades now, every war game that's been done, every analysis of alternatives that are done ad nauseum, they've always identified the cyber sort of threat as our Achilles heel, right? It's the way we're most likely to be rendered sort of enfeebled in a space capability in the near term. The kinetic kinds of things, they make great news and great headlines, but actually the biggest threat is more along lines. But the question is, okay, there's kind of two parts to this, really. There's why can't the cyber protection part of this, why can't that be commercial too? Like why is it that has to be something that needs to be sort of government designed, or does it? I'd be curious everybody's perspective on that. And then specifically, we have actually related to that, we have a question from the audience that relates to that has to do with zero trust. Does zero trust and the space sector, do they intersect in any way? Or if you have a perspective on that? And I think I might start with Dave on this one, since it's kind of it ties to the intelligence community in a lot of ways. But obviously we can't talk classified here, but you're, everybody on the panel is a technical person too, and so I'm very curious about that.
Well, first, security and cybersecurity are absolutely critical to working with any type of data, especially in our business, and for anyone's business for that matter. And that's why I believe there's a lot to learn from the commercial industry in this regard. Commercial clouds are robust, they're distributed, they're well defended of their own right, and they should be extended into space. So whatever we do network-wise, terrestrially, we'll be doing in space.
And in some cases, we are doing
and we
in
are
space.
doing in space. And so therefore, to answer your question directly, zero trust is absolutely a component of that, because I think that's the way we're migrating to a more defensible operation. And a couple people have mentioned the hybrid architecture. So we have to find a way to bring the best of commercial capabilities when it comes to cybersecurity and defense,
right,
in with what the government is doing with its architecture as well, because we will not be swimming in lanes that are completely separated. We will be working together.
I mean, I think about the Pentagon. When I was in the Pentagon all those years, the computers that I did the most classified, talked about the most classified programs that the U.S. government does, that was on a Dell computer, right? It had Microsoft Outlook on it. It obviously had other things running on it. Those were commercial processors, and I wonder, like you said, I mean, these satellites, they're servers on orbit, right? Why can't we just think of them that way? Why can't we protect them in a similar fashion? I don't know, Steve, if you've got a perspective on that.
I think it's a great point, and it does remind me of when I was in the Pentagon and thinking about future conflict and competition. It was often said that the first shots may be in space of that conflict, and the first type of shot would very likely be cyber. So it is very, very real. We're talking about then hybrid architectures, the government leveraging commercial capabilities, commercial constellations. So having robust cybersecurity is a really essential part of that. Now, if individual companies are coming forward, it's very hard to do that on your own and have the expertise. You may be a small company where you're trying to focus on getting the mission capability out there, and that's where I think being part of these ecosystems and partnerships, for instance, with Microsoft, there is tremendous investment that happens in that. Microsoft, because of its overall platform and users across the globe, is able to understand what the threat picture is like out there. there's 8 trillion signals that are understood and analyzed each day by defensive professionals to understand and protect these networks. So tremendous investment, tremendous capabilities. The commercial sector, for instance, 95% of Fortune 500 companies are on these clouds. They need their data protected, as does the government. So I do think that leveraging these platforms from a commercial perspective makes a lot of sense, and then extending it into space.
So basically, you're saying, and I would agree with you on this, that the idea, I mean, we have a satellite company in Denver, and we don't make our solar arrays, right? Those are made by a supplier, right? We make the bus and software and all that kind of stuff. We outsource that. Sounds to me like what you're saying is these commercial companies, if they outsource their cybersecurity through Azure or whatever your competitors, that would be a perfectly viable way, at least for maybe not everything, but a lot of things.
And I think it comes down to the data and how you're protecting the data
Yeah.
and where it's going and what environments and how it's transiting and processing, and ultimately where are you putting that. The other just plug I would put out there is for the Space ISAC, Information Sharing and Analysis Center, which is a nonprofit group that brings industry together with the public government to share threats, to share data, and it's a forum that's growing and is really important.
That's great. I think, if I'm not mistaken, I think Small Sat Alliance has partnered with them. I think we're pushing them as well as a good, viable thing. Audrey, from the stratosphere of policy, what's your perspective on all this stuff?
Yeah, well, Steve actually just stole my thunder. I was going to talk about the Space ISAC as well, which is okay. You know, the cyber challenge is one I think we're really, you know, we're just still trying to get our arms around in terms of understanding the threat and, you know, how to deal with it. And I mean, it's funny, you mentioned like war games and such where, you know, there's always a cyber threat. Well, there's also like cyber fairy dust that we also sprinkle over in terms of how effective our capabilities in cyber are going to be too. And I think it's just an area where the space community is sort of, like I said, just still grappling with even just understanding the scope of the challenges. And so, you know, the Space ISAC that Steve mentioned actually was sort of precipitated by a policy the last administration released with regard to the cybersecurity of space systems. So if you haven't seen that space policy directive, I'd encourage you to look at that as well. And I think this is an area where you'll see this administration, you know, continue that focus on cybersecurity, certainly for space, but really across the board.
Excellent. And the good Colonel, any perspective on this? Just generally on, you know, I'll just say this. I'll put my own plug in. It used to frustrate me when I had a job like yours 1,000 years ago, and it just seems like the government too often just wants to study things, right? Instead of getting on and actually doing it. It's the easy, safe, bureaucratic punt. Make sure no one gets fired. But it gets in the way of, and frankly, it's the opposite of the world I'm in now, investment banking and private equity, where you want to go as fast as you can because you don't want to miss a deal because somebody else is going to take that deal, right, and make money on it. So I'm curious if you have any kind of perspective on any of this stuff we've talked about.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, cybersecurity is not just a government problem, as I think has already been said. It's really a problem across all industries these days, and certainly still for the government. From a PLEO casino perspective, we're advancing the technology, moving it forward in a lot of different ways. Mesh networking in space, BMC3, these optical, high-speed, low-latency data links, onboard processing, edge processing, right? And so as we look to connect more systems together and connect commercial with government systems and build this hybrid architecture that's kind of unsiloed, protecting that data is absolutely critical. And so, you know, a key example I like to give is actually on Blackjack and our partnership with DARPA. There's a part of the program called PIPBOSS. And PIPBOSS is responsible for autonomous operations, onboard data processing. It's kind of the brain of the constellation. And one of its responsibilities is also that cybersecurity aspect, encrypting the data so that, you know, you have the right separation between the two sides, and that you're able to protect the data, especially as you're trying to get it not just to data repositories that have kind of established ground infrastructures, but also to tactical users that might be out in the field. That's an enormous problem. We're trying to tackle it with Pit Boss.
Excellent. We got a little bit more time. I saw that an old colleague of mine, we were actually colonels together, which makes me feel very, very old. John Heighton, he was a very senior colonel, and I was a very junior colonel. But I saw in the paper today that he's I guess because he's getting close to retiring, so he's a little more outspoken. But he's talking about his frustrations. The same thing about not going fast enough. That we're kind of missing the boat here. That we've got to go fast in order to address the China threat and all these other things. There was recently in 2019, and I'm sure we all know a lot more about this than what we can talk about, in the open forum. But you remember the Russian satellite Cosmos 2542 launch. This was reported in Space News, and then inside, like one of those little Russian nested dolls, was another satellite that came out and did some pretty close proximity ops to some satellites very near and dear to all of us. And we really couldn't do a whole lot about it. And in terms of responsiveness, in terms of, it's a frustration. Frankly, it had to, I spent a lot of time in Europe. It kind of was an embarrassment, right? And maybe this isn't a great forum to talk about, but I'm curious if you guys have any perspective on that, on just the response, call it the responsive space sort of a thing. I know actually Congress, they were the ones that pushed what came to be called operationally responsive space, and very much the department was kicking and screaming into it from the HASC, and this was actually, I think, before Steve's time on the HASC when a lot of the stuff, but it's gaining traction. But any perspective any of you guys have on that? I use that as an example. You don't have to talk to that one specifically, but this idea that things happen, bad things happen, we don't plan for them to happen, they happen, and we need a way to respond quickly. Go ahead,
Well,
Dave.
I can start, and I got the opportunity to talk to General Heighton about some of these issues too. So he is pushing the boundaries for sure. But one of the first issues we have in the environment is lack of transparency. And that exists for many reasons. First, because it's hard, it's a large volume of space to have that understanding and awareness of what's going on there. And also it's mired by intense secrecy. And so what we see happening, and we're advocating for commercial industry to step into this role, is more space situational awareness, space domain awareness capabilities. We are talking about so many, I would say, the space situational awareness collection capabilities across academia, government, commercial, et cetera, that it will be possible for it to be a very transparent environment.
Right.
And once you have that, you can make actions of the adversary known to the world,
Right.
known to the public. We can begin the step of responsible governance
Right.
and international agreements and norms and behaviors.
Right.
And we can lay the domain bare for all to see, so to speak, and then move forward in a way that we can protect ourselves and each other.
I guess it's that last part that I'm concerned about, to be able to move forward. It was very transparent when Russia moved on Ukraine, when Russia moved on Georgia. Right, that was very transparent, but there wasn't a whole lot we could do about it. And this definitely gets more into the Audrey side of things in a lot of ways. But I want to give her more time to think about it and let Steve. Steve, do you have any thoughts on this one?
Well, not speaking to the Russia example in particular, but in general on responsiveness, extremely important. And a report just came out from RAND, and it talks about the whole clean sheet approach for establishing the Space Force. And it's a really good report that was done. Definitely commend it to people. And it gives a lot of recommendations on how to move at speed. And I just reflect that it is a large area to address with many elements of it. Just by way of giving one example, having been in the Pentagon and now being out in industry and having seen how some of the decision-making processes are, if you're in the United States Space Force right now at the Space Systems Command, you're likely working on the 2024 Program Objective Memorandum. The 2024 POM, the OSD right now is working on the 23 POM, and the Hill is, or the 23 budget with the White House, and the Hill is working on 22 on getting that out, which is next year's budget. The reason I say this is because at the tip of the spear, at the end of it, people like Colonel T and others are actually planning the budgets for 2 years out or longer by the time they actually get the money and potentially have the competition and can actually go execute. The world's going to change again in that 2 years. So how do we enable the structure to be able to move fast so Colonel T and others have the authorities, have the right processes in place to actually respond? So it's a bigger kind of area that we have to think about, but I think that money and authorities are an important piece of it.
You know, I think one of the things on that is we still think of satellites and satellite systems as being these really hard things, right? Like, oh, they're going to take years to do, but they don't really have to anymore. They really are. What we're learning is that you don't need super rad hardened processors in LEO if you only want the capability to last 5 years, right? So the price of these spacecraft buses and that kind of stuff are coming down to like $1 million. They're almost the price of an expensive, Dell server. So I'm wondering if maybe we need to think about like you talked about the acquisition process, the palming process, all that kind of stuff. MFP-11, the special operator guys, if they need a bunch of Toyota 4Runners or whatever to go hunt down bad guys, they just go buy them, right? They don't worry about palming, X number of specially modified Toyota 4Runners, for 5 years out. And I'm wondering if that may be part of the problem. I don't know. Audrey, I'm gonna ask you to weigh in on this one.
Sure. I mean, so I'm going to step back a little bit to where you were in terms of talking about, the need to potentially defend U.S. assets from counterspace threats. And of course, the incident in 2019 was certainly, got a lot of people's attention. But I think we need to step back and ask ourselves if that's like the situation we want to even be in the first place, where we have, small numbers of satellites. I think General Hyten, in the same interview you're referencing, he called them big, juicy targets. Where it could be a really bad day if just a couple of satellites were lost. And so this is actually where I think the private sector has a lot to bring to bear, where we can leverage, we can buy services, as Tim was talking about, we can modify sort of gently and actually enhance the resilience of our constellations through whether it's proliferation, diversification, new orbital regimes, and just frankly new ways of acquiring capability, right, through service models, which inherently are more flexible than needing to buy your own satellite. And so the idea being, if the government doesn't have just one or two platforms that it's relying on for a critical mission, but has hundreds of platforms, then one incident of a sort of a threat along the lines that you described, may not be as catastrophic as it could be, with the architecture we grew up with.
Like a defense in depth kind of a thing. In other words, we have all these other things. We have other ways to get to work besides just the one way to get to work.
Exactly.
Right. Tim, I'm going to give you the last word, and I think our time is about up. Is that right? So you get the last word, and then I'll try to do a quick wrap up.
That's a lot of pressure, but thank you. So, kind of what I would say is it's not just about what we're buying; it's about how we're buying it. This is my second assignment out in El Segundo. I was there for 4 years, from 2010 to 2014 at SMC, and now here at what is now SSC as of about a month ago, having been here for another 2 years, or there in El Segundo. And what I've seen from our leadership all the way up is they are actually empowering us as material leaders, program managers, to make decisions, to move out, to take smart risk. And when things don't work perfectly, they're not killing us for it. They're letting us fail quickly. As long as we took a calculated risk, they're letting us fail fast, learn fast, and move on. And so I think that's a big piece of how we actually take advantage of commercial But then it's also, this is a team sport, so it's across all of government, it's with our allied partners, with our commercial partners, and being able to take those smart risks and move fast, I think is coming to fruition. I'm seeing it at SSC.
That's encouraging. I can tell you're an honest guy, so that must really be, you must, at the pointy end of the spear, you're seeing it happen. Well, thank you to INSA and AFCEA for sponsoring this panel. It's been a heck of a lot of fun and enlightening. You know, on behalf of the Small Sat Alliance, we're just about 60 companies now, so I'll give my own little plug. Very proud of the folks, and we advocate for the use, as no surprise to anybody here, advocate for the use of all these commercial technologies into all the different programs and projects and problems that the government's trying to solve. So thank you on behalf of them for your service to country and for being on the panel today. And that's all I've got. So thank you very much.
Nicely done.